So if catharsis is not in the general aggression model, because what our research showed is that it just didn't work, let's talk about what is and what theories make up pieces of this general aggression model. And specifically, let's start with the proximate model. Remember, the proximate model has the person and the situation starting. They interact to influence the internal state. And the internal state is where we need to start the building process. The good thing about the GAM in terms of how it was built is it was largely already built for us. So remember the reappraisal decision-making box in the GAM? That was already built from the attribution stuff, right? And that is, by the way, testable again, like I've already said. Just that picture of it, not Kelly's cube or anything like that. Just the picture and how the general aggression model's reappraisal processes work. All right, the one with the reappraisal and the figure. So that was already built. So really what we have to do is, and this is what Anderson and Bushman had to do, is figure out what's going on in the middle. So what internal state variables are important? And the first place they started with this theory. This was a theory by a man named Berkowitz. Okay, Berkowitz. And what he did is he came up with something called the cognitive neo-Associatic theory, which is a lot of syllables there. And I'm going to condense this to be much shorter and less complex than it actually is for the sake of this course. But what he said was that you take a frustrating stimuli, and that leads to negative affect. And frustrating stimuli was broad. It can be a provocation. It can be a screaming baby next to you on the airplane. It could be a really gross smell. It could be heat, like how hot you are. Whatever is going on that frustrates you leads to negative affect. And negative affect doesn't mean hostile affect. All right, let's be clear on that. Negative affect and the word affect that's in the GAM are not the same. They're related, but not the same. Negative affect just means like you're in a bad mood. It can mean sadness, angst, anxiety. It can mean hostility, like in the aggression domain. But it means all these things. And what's going to happen is when you experience that negative affect because of the frustration you feel from something in the environment, that's going to lead to either anger, which leads to aggression, or fear, which leads to escape. All right? And that's what he said, is that you have these two routes. So imagine, let's take heat, for example. If you're really, really hot, that's frustrating to you because you don't like to be hot. That's going to lead to negative affect. It's going to put you in a bad mood. And that's either going to lead to one of two things. The fear escape route would mean basically like, fear is just a weird term. I don't like the word fear here. But basically what's going to happen is you're going to feel like you need to get out of there. And you're going to run to your air-conditioned house. And that's you escaping the heat. On the other side, let's say you can't escape the heat. Let's say your air conditioner in your house is broken. What's going to happen is that's going to lead to anger, and the anger is going to lead to aggression. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you're like me, and like a lot of people I know, if you're really hot, like just blah, you're sweaty hot, and you can't get into like a nice cool area, or you can't cool off, you're just really irritable, right? Like, for example, when I went to go visit my grandmother, apparently old people have really thin skin, and so they're cold like all the time. So I went to visit my grandmother once and she's still alive today. And my God, her house was like, it was 100 degrees outside. And she just had the windows open. And she's like, I'm kind of chilly. I need a jacket. I'm like sitting over here sweating. And like my son, who was one at the time, he's like really irritable and really kind of pissy, to be honest. It's because he was just so hot he couldn't escape it. No matter how many clothes we took off my son or, whatever, it's like you're still just freaking hot. And that's exactly what's happening here. So if this theory was going to be included in the GAM, what we have to do is justify it. All right, so we have to do a study that tests this theory to make sure it's accurate. And now what's happening here is this is the word that we're looking at specifically is anger. Anger is the word affect in the present internal state from the general aggression model. So what we have to figure out is does frustrating stimuli up here, does that cause anger, which causes aggression? How does that work? So don't worry about this. Let's just get that. Let's go to this one. Yeah, so let's be clear. I'm not going to test you on anything on this slide. I just forgot to delete it. So let's go to this one, though. So this was a study by Anderson and his colleagues in 2000. And what he did is he randomly assigned participants to be in temperature-controlled rooms of varying degrees. And these ranged from 54 degrees, which is cold, 98 degrees, which is hot, and these were just the range. There were other rooms as well. Now, remember, I worked in his lab. And so I remember when I interviewed there, we went up to his lab rooms, and there was like little individual kind of closet-sized cubbies that could only fit like a desk and a chair. And then a thermometer, a temperature gauge was right next to it that read, "Do not touch." So you can actually do this carefully and experimentally. So participants are randomly assigned to a variety of room temperatures. And then afterwards, they got to do the competitive reaction time task, so the noise intensity blasts. And that's what this is right here on the y-axis. This is the CRT scores. And what you see here is that when the temperature was really hot or the temperature was really cold, aggression was really high compared to when the temperature was, comfortable. And what this suggests is that, sure enough, heat influences aggression. And the cognitive new association model would say it's because of anger. And it's because of studies like this. That's why the word affect is in the present internal state. All right. Now, one thing I want to say is one thing that's going to be a trick for you guys is being able to separate whether or not a variable like heat influences the trait or the state. So let's be clear on that. If I were to randomly assign you to be hot right now, just like in this Anderson study right here, that is a situational variable because you're feeling it right now. All right. But what if you live in, let's say, like the southern United States, like Texas, for example, all right, versus someone who lives in like Montana. Texas is just a hotter state, right? It's closer to the equator. It's just hotter there. Well, if you live in a hot area, that is going to influence your personality. All right, that is not a situational variable because it's not what you feel right now. It's just all around you all the time, and that's going to be how you live. All right. So that's kind of how these things work. So a better example might be like media violence exposure, right? Like if I had you play a game right now and then turned off the screen, that is the situation. But if I asked you over the course of 10 years, 20 years, how often have you played violent games, that is going to be the learning part of the distal. So that fits in the distal GAM. If I had you play a game right now, that's in the proximate GAM. This study right here, the Anderson study, because we randomly assign people to rooms of varying temperatures, that is the proximate GAM. But if I compared people who live in Texas versus people who lived in Montana, for example, and didn't provoke them or anything, that is their personality. That's the proximate model. I hope that makes sense, but that's the way that works. All right. So check. We have affect. All right. What's next? Cognition. Ooh, we've seen this picture before, haven't we? Yes, we have. Aggressive related priming. Remember, the way it's going to work is if we show you a picture or have you play a game or have you watch a TV show or say the word violence or whatever, that's going to lead to priming of aggressive cognitions. And through spreading activations, scripts will then be enacted, and then scripts get evaluated to influence behavior. Just like we learned for exam 1. We've seen this before, right? This is the cognitive piece. So if the cognitive neo-association theory was the affect internal state, aggressive priming is the cognition internal state, all right? And in terms of a study that predicted that, there was this handsome scholar, this guy, that's me. What we did is we were looking at video game violence. And what we had is participants were randomly assigned to play a violent or non-violent game for 15 minutes. Just so you know, the violent game was Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. I don't know if you've ever seen this game. It was for the PlayStation 2. It is incredibly violent. I suggest you YouTube it if you're really curious about it. But it's like one-on-one fighting, a lot of blood, a lot of death, a lot of swords, it's just gross. All right, a lot of violence. The control game, the non-violent game, was Hard Hitters Tennis. The trick with video game research or any media research is to find an equivalent match to your violent stimuli. So Mortal Kombat is a one-on-one fighting game where two people use objects like swords and stuff or their fists to basically hurt each other and kill each other. So it's very competitive. It's a one-on-one. There's objects. There's a competition factor. It's just all that's going on. So we had to find an equivalent to that. And I thought tennis. You also have a one-on-one situation. It's competitive. It's fast-paced. But there's no touching. And there's also objects, the racket. But there's no touching. There's no physical acts of violence that could occur. All right? And then what we did after that is we had them complete a measure of aggressive priming. These are sample items right here of aggressive priming. So the way it works is if you're thinking aggressively, you'll fill this in with kill, maybe kick. All right? But if you're thinking non-aggressively, maybe you'll say kiss, all right? Kilt, kiln, kind, like there's a bunch of words. This one right here, same idea. Guess which one is the violent one? Well, if you fill it in shoot, that's a violent, but if you fill in, or even shout, but what if you filled in like shirt? All right, and what you do is there's 98 of these specific fragments, and what you do is the more words that are filled in aggressively, that's going to be indicative of aggressive thoughts, and that's the way we measure priming. All right, and then after that, we had him do the hot sauce paradigm. All right, as we described before. Here's what we find. All right, I'm not going to test you on these numbers. All right, and don't worry about this. We never went over that. All right, so don't worry about that. But what we found basically is that what game you're assigned to, so this is going to be the violent game in particular, correlated with the number of aggressive thoughts that you had. So the people in the violent game listed more aggressive thoughts than people in the non-violent game. And the higher your aggressive thoughts was related to more of the hot sauce, and the hotter of the hot sauce you put into that cup. And so what this tells us is that in terms of media violence exposure, specifically video game stuff, what we see is that we do see this relationship such that the video game that you play is related to ensuing behaviors. And if the game is violent, your behavior is likely to be aggressive. Now, a lot of you may say, oh my gosh, Chris, I don't believe it. I don't believe this because I've played video games that were violent for years and I've never killed anybody. But think about what that means, right? That's what a lot of critics will say. And in all reality, that's not what we're saying. Think about the aggression continuum, all right? We're not looking at that type of violence. What we're saying here is that if you play a violent game, then you turn it off, you're likely to be primed aggressively. And that aggressive priming will eventually predict behavior. All right, that's all we're saying, and that behavior is likely to be aggressive, right? So it's kind of interesting how that all plays out. But this, my study wasn't the first. I mean, obviously it was done in 2009. The general aggression model has been around for much longer than that. But and I don't like citing myself. I think it's a little arrogant and awkward. But I do here, just because I wanted to show you an example of what a video game study looks like, right? Because it's a hot topic. It always has been and always will be a hot topic. But in addition to that, what we have is we have this situation where we're trying to predict aggressive behavior. And this study, I thought, was a good representation of how thoughts lead to behavior, right? And so that's why I picked this study in particular. It didn't build the general aggression model, but it is predicted by the general aggression model because it had the word cognition in it. So priming is the reason why the word cognition is in it. And this study, by the one that I did in 2009, it shows evidence of why that's important. So affect, check. Cognitive association theory, all good. This one, check. Now, it's not just video games that lead to this. There was a study by Berkowitz, same Berkowitz as before, and Lepage, 1967. And what they did is they showed people a gun, a real firearm, a gun. And guess what? They showed that what they showed is that if you literally see a gun sitting on the desk, that's going to prime aggressive thoughts, which lead to behavior. Now, they didn't have a measure of aggressive thoughts like I did here, but they show that if you have a gun sitting on the desk versus like a badminton racket, you're going to be more aggressive towards a partner. So it's exposure to anything aggressive. It doesn't have to be media related, just like the Berkowitz and Lepage. But needless to say, this is one way in which the stimuli you see primes you aggressively, which then predicts your behavior accordingly. So check, cognitions.